So this park here is called Sandy Creek Park. I was delighted when I first discovered it. I come here very regularly when I am in the United States. It's just a lovely little park with a lot of different habitats and a lot of little creatures wandering around. Here is a classic example of a flooded forest in a temperate part of the world. This is North Carolina in the Durham area. You can see how the forest is flooded at this time of the year. This is actually autumn or fall period, around November. These shallows are typically favored by small fish and tadpoles. So the frogs would obviously lay their eggs in these shallows, and toads too, and you'd have the tadpoles appearing. I can actually see a number of fish in the water right now. I might not be able to pick them up with this particular camera, it's my cell phone, but there are fish swimming around. I'm not sure whether you can see right to the right hand side of that limb. There are fish swimming in there, tiny little fish. This is another typical flooded forest that one would typically find down south in the North Carolina area. A lot of these trees are dead though, and this is usually what happens when you have something like a beaver, creating a beaver dam and blocking the flow of the water so that a kind of dam forms and it floods the area. We haven't had a lot of rain thus far, so it's really mostly due to blocking of the water flow, but typical sort of flooded forest area for this region. Here we have an example of a compound leaf. This is actually Campsis radicans. It's a trumpet vine that grows up trees. You can see it's growing up this box elder, and if I move across here you can see the leaves of a box elder, also compound, 5 leaflets, but much larger than the leaflets on the trumpet vine. So the box elder is the only maple species that has compound leaves. All the others have simple leaves, and I'll show you a few maples on the way, but this is a classic example of one tree of the same genus that has a different leaf arrangement, or leaf type rather, than other leaves. Here's a beautiful shot of the fruits called samaras or winged nuts of a box elder, which is a maple species, Asanegundo. It's the only maple species with compound leaves, as I've mentioned before. It's a glorious day today, lovely blue skies, perfect fall or autumn day, and above me we're looking at a Catalpa tree, Catalpa speciosa. It's from the Bignoniaceae, and right next to it is a white oak. It's got kind of a light bark, and it has a typical oak leaves with rounded margins rather than pointed, which would be more characteristic of the red oaks. There's a nice pine tree. If I move across, you can see an American sycamore tree, which has really large leaves. The closest looking leaf, in appearance at least, is the tulip tree, which is from the Bignoniaceae, but totally unrelated. Anyway, that's some of the beautiful trees in this park. So on this American sycamore tree, you can see that it has sort of a peeling bark, and then as you go higher up the stem, there's less and less bark on the stem, and it eventually becomes kind of quite smooth in texture. It's very characteristic. This is a strategy used by a lot of trees that are trying to get rid of parasites and avoid parasites. So they'll constantly debark to prevent parasites from gaining a foothold on their bark. Here I've discovered a little snake, and I'm not even sure what it is, but it's curled up in these leaves, which are the leaves of a sycamore, and it's completely relaxed, obviously waiting. It could be waiting for the sun to come through and warm it up, but also might be wanting to hunt. It's a tiny little snake, it's not that big. I have to be careful because there are very dangerous snakes in this area. So if this is a juvenile venomous snake, you've got to be careful. If you look at the snake, there's always a possibility a snake of this size could be a juvenile copperhead in this region. I think it's Agkistrodon contortix, if I remember correctly. Anyway, very, very venomous, and even the young are venomous, and they will often give you a full injection of all the venom they have rather than hold back like the adults might do to save energy in terms of wasting the venom. So not to be treated lightly. I was actually bending down here to do a video on the sycamore leaves themselves. If I pan out, you can see this rather large sycamore leaf, American sycamore leaf, that the snake is on. Wonderful find. Here we have the bipinnately compound leaves of a tree which is actually an exotic in this region called Albizia, Albizia julibrissin. Albizias are typically more subtropical to tropical trees, and they have an umbrella-like canopy typically, and they are from the Fabaceae, which is the bean family. But you can see the very, very distinctive compound leaves. They get pinkish purple blossoms. Here we have the trunks of two very, very beautiful large river birches. Betula nigra is the species name. The birches don't grow for very long because they're very weak trees. They often break in the wind. They snap off, and they're also often infested with a lot of beetles and other wood-boring beetles, etc., that destroy them. But lovely trees with very characteristic bark. So these are river birch, Betula nigra. If I move across, you'll see there's a large snag or standing dead tree. Right at the top there are some holes made by woodpeckers. I don't know whether you're going to be able to see them through this lot, but these are a favorite for birds like woodpeckers, not only for making their nests but also for feeding on all kinds of wood-boring creatures. You can see a lot of holes in this dead trunk. So it's basically early autumn, and we have these persistent fruits here. I believe this is an Amur privet. I could be wrong though, but I'm going to assume it's an Amur privet. Ligustrum is the genus. This is from the Polygonaceae, the genus Polygonum or Persicaria. They've changed the genus recently from Polygonum to Persicaria, depending on, I guess, certain features, which I'm not familiar with. But this is a typical water plant. It's always found in wet areas, and it always has these very characteristic sort of leaf sheaths. You'll see here, I'll show you as I move the camera down. So there you can see the characteristic leaf sheath at the base of the leaf petiole or leaf stalk. Here's another example of a Persicaria from the Polygonaceae. That's the aquatic plant I was talking about earlier. I'm not certain of the species. I'm not familiar with this area really, but nonetheless very interesting, pretty little flower. So I just found some tracks here, and by the looks of it, it looks like the footprint of perhaps something like a raccoon. You can see the toe prints there, but I'm not really sure. Still nice to see. Here's another one. You can see the hand-like footprint. This makes me think definitely a raccoon. And over here, it looks like part of a bird track. You can see the toe there, right across there. And it comes from this area, which is typically where one would find raccoons washing their food off and feeding. There are some deer tracks down at the bottom there too, indented in the sand, so obviously the deer come here to drink and perhaps to hide in the evenings. I'll try to go down there. So yep, definitely deer tracks. You can see over there it's actually splayed its hooves in the mud, in the soft mud, and there's some tracks coming in the opposite direction here. There's also some human tracks, and there are dog tracks around here too. I'll show you. Let's see, there's some more deer tracks over there, and there's a dog track over there, and there's another one. The toes are pointing towards us, and the claw marks are definitely indented there, so dog tracks as well. Typically what one would find in sort of a temperate area which is well frequented by people and wildlife. So this is a very tranquil setting here. We're in the riverbed. It's a small river, might be called a stream by some people. In Africa this would be considered a river, especially in the drier parts. And you can see the water slowly flowing through and into the distance there. Watersheds are very, very important for wildlife and for human beings too. So a watershed is essentially where rivers get all their water from, and it starts out as small little drops of water and then little rills, and gradually it builds up to form little rivulets and then little streams, and finally the streams combine to form rivers, which eventually merge into a main river that comes out into the sea, usually as a delta, or in dry land as a delta. It might open up into the middle of nowhere like the Okavango Delta and not reach the sea, but if it does reach the sea it forms an estuary that's very important as a nursery for fish. This plant with the very bright red stem is Phytolacca dioica, I think, or Phytolacca americana, I'm not sure, I can't remember the name specifically, but it is one of the pokeweed plants. It has these berries that ripen to black, and they have this inky staining substance. There are berries on this plant. I'll go a little bit closer, just in the background there. Just try and zoom right in there. Yep, right in the middle of the picture roughly, you can see some blackberries. So the pokeweed. This is not a great shot, but it's a red maple, sometimes called a swamp maple, because they like to have their feet or their roots in very wet sort of environments. The leaves are typical maple leaves, and they have 3 lobes. And it's kind of hard to see at this angle, and the light, with this light as well, it's not making it easy. Maybe I'll find a better example later. But the red maple, during the autumn period the leaves turn red as well, hence the name. This is a tree that might sometimes be mistaken for a maple. It has these palmate leaves, kind of similar to maple leaves, but this is a liquid amber styraciflua, which is a gum tree. I always forget the common names, but yeah, it's called a gum tree, and it has these very characteristic cone-like fruits which are woody, and typically grows in disturbed areas. Here's a classic example of animal sign, usually a digging animal. You can see where the dirt has been thrown out, and there's a very characteristic sort of hole here, and I would bet it's a dog. In fact, yeah, you can see some canine tracks. There are many different vines that grow up the trees in a northern sort of deciduous forest. Here you can see a catbrier. They have characteristic sort of glossy leaves, and they usually have 3 large veins from the base. The leaves are different shaped. Some are sort of more triangular like these, and others are sort of more rounded. They are called catbriers partly because they have thorns, kind of like, I guess, like cat's claws. You might be able to see the tiny thorn just over there. And here's a different species with sort of broader leaves. You can see the characteristic 3 veins, main veins from the base of the leaf, and it has twines or tendrils as well. There you can see some really large spines on this one. It's kind of hard to see right over there. This is a very infamous vine that one should keep well away from. This is poison ivy. You can see the characteristic sort of hairy adventitious roots all up the stem of the plant that's twining up this tree, and you can see the trifoliate leaves. Characteristic of them, they have berries. They produce a very toxic or caustic sap, which is what causes the problems when you get poison ivy. It causes sort of swelling and blisters on the skin. Not very pleasant, but poison ivy, you want to avoid this at all costs. Some similar plants to this in terms of their effect and also related are poison oak, and then also a rus species, which is a sumac, poison sumac. All to be avoided, really. Earlier I spoke about sort of twining or climbing plants like vines. This is actually a rose, a Multiflora rose, I believe. It is somewhat twining or scrambling. It forms these bushes and it will climb up plants for purchase. You can see it's kind of interlocked with the poison ivy, which is right in front of us. And then if you look at this stem here, this is actually a wild grape. You can see the tendrils there. It's one of the characteristics of the Vitaceae or grape family. And I can't really see any leaves right now for the wild grape, but I'm pretty certain this is a wild grape. I could be wrong, but more than likely wild grape. We also have in this area clematis. Here we have an example of a muscadine grape. You can see the vine growing up the tree, and there are the leaves. So here we have a rose bush again. You can see it's kind of scrambling up over everything here, and it has these characteristic red fruits which are called hips, rose hips, and they are edible. From the family Rosaceae, the rose family. So here we have a catbrier again, one of the briars, and you can see the black berries on it. And then in the background there is an ivy creeper which is growing Heterohelix is the genus, a scientific name, growing in the background up that tree. Another example of a willow. There are many different species of willows. I'm not certain of this exact species. I'm no expert as far as that's concerned, but has a characteristic sort of lanceolate leaves and this sort of furrowed stem that you see there. This is a small willow and it's growing in its typical habitat, which is sort of damp, moist area right next to a body of water, and very, very weak wood, but the bark is very, very useful in terms of making things like aspirin, which is a pain reliever and an anti-inflammatory. So in this sort of wetland area, we have these plants with the sort of arrow-shaped leaves. I believe this plant is from the Elm Ulmaceae. That family has got characteristic leaves and habit and habitat for that family. I'll try to find out what that is. I'm not absolutely certain. Earlier we were looking at some other maples. This is actually a silver maple, Saccharinum, and you can see why they call it silver maple. The bark is quite light, but also the underneath of the leaf is quite silvery in color, so it's kind of very characteristic, and quite deeply divided leaf lobes as well. So in a wetland, one can typically find a lot of grass species and a lot of sedges in particular, and then also rushes of the family Juncaceae, and here an example of the Typhaceae, which is the bulrushes, sometimes called cat's tails. And you can see the sort of fruiting body of the cat's tail, which produces these seeds attached to a fluff that will eventually sort of the fruiting body will eventually sort of burst open and release all these fluffy seeds to blow in the wind and disperse. So typically at the top of the flower you would have male anthers with the pollen, and lower down the female stigmas for receiving the pollen. And so what happens is, as the wind blows, it's wind pollinated. As the wind blows, the pollen drops down and can self-pollinate the plants, or to prevent self-pollination, there might be a slight difference in time in terms of the development of the pollen versus the ovaries. So very interesting plant. The pollen can be used to sprinkle over pancakes, and the rhizome can be used to actually make pancakes. You can dry the rhizome up or underground stem and grind it up into a flour and then use it to cook a pancake. This is a conifer, an eastern red cedar actually, Juniperus virginiana, so the juniper family. Junipers are used to make gin, the fruits of the junipers. So the eastern red cedar is what this one is called. It's often found in the same areas where one gets Atlantic white cedar, which is Chemisiparis thioides. It's a completely different genus and species, but also a conifer. So it has the typical scale-like leaves. If I move closer, you'll be able to see. And it produces these kind of bluish-grey berries, which have kind of a harsh taste, but they are obviously used to make gin. I often come here in the mornings when I'm in the United States and just kind of look out over the pond, and we often see, my wife and I, we see a lot of Canada geese and occasionally other ducks, and interestingly enough, what we believe are nutrias. We see them swimming. We can't get a look at the tail to confirm whether they're nutrias or beavers, but I suspect that they are nutrias. Anyway, it's nice to know. Although I have to say, in the early morning, we have heard sort of tail slaps on the water, which is characteristic of beavers before they dive. So I'm not seeing any beaver lodges, although I know that they might also form sort of lodges under the edge of banks, river banks, etc. And as far as nutrias are concerned, I'm not seeing any pile or heap of sticks that would suggest a nutria lodge, so I'm not really sure, but we do see these giant rodents swimming around here every now and then, which is pretty curious, but a lovely little area. Here we have another raccoon track in the mud right next to the water. So after talking about beavers and nutrias, I found this pile of sticks, and it looks like the lodge possibly of a beaver. I'm just going to walk around and move in closer, and maybe it's a nutria, who knows, it's kind of hard to tell here, but if you look very carefully you can see there's an entrance hole here, or burrow, leading down into the bottom of what is possibly a beaver lodge or a nutria lodge. I have no idea, but it's pretty exciting. I am seeing some small dog tracks, so obviously the dogs smell them, and I have seen what looks like raccoon tracks here. I'm trying to see something that might look like beaver tracks, but I'm not really finding anything convincing, but it's pretty cool. I'll just zoom out again. Okay, let's see what else I can find here. I think I might have a jackpot here, if I'm not mistaken. It's hard to see with the shadows here, but let's see. There's the toes here, and there's kind of a heel pad there. Heel pad there, toes, quite sharp. It has more like a long hand, but it's probably a back foot, but it's pretty big. So I might even go with a beaver. Cannot say for certain, but it's pretty cool. Okay, jackpot. This has got to be a beaver lodge. This is another much larger one that I've just found, kind of hidden by the vegetation. It just looks like a pile of sticks, but clearly it's been made here. So I'm going to just move around, see whether I can get a better angle. But obviously the entrance comes in from the river side, or from the water side. Let's just see what I can find. There's a small hole or opening that leads into what looks like a sort of underground chamber that's just above the water. That would be typical for a beaver lodge. There we can see the beavers lodge. Here we have the beaver run that's leading into the lodge here. You can see this is a long sort of muddy run. It looks like it's going from both sides, from two sides, and typically you'd have the drag marks of a beaver tail as well. It's kind of hard for me to know for certain, unless I'm actually looking at a beaver lodge, if it's a beaver tail drag or maybe the belly drag of something like an otter. But anyway, they would leave a tail drag and then characteristic footprints as well. I'm going to see whether I can get in here over all these brambles and have a closer look. So there's no entrance here to the lodge. This is just where the beavers are coming up to kind of add to their lodge. There are a lot of tracks of other animals, dogs in particular, and maybe some raccoons as well. In fact, you can see there, that's a dog track there, it appears to be. That over there looks like a handprint, maybe from a raccoon. Not sure for certain though, but it looks like it. There's another dog print over there. And they kind of look like rodent claw marks over there on the edge of the bank there. Small rodents, of course, so murids. Obviously this will be used a lot by all kinds of animals coming in. Things like muskrats might also use this area. Who knows? Great blue heron. This is one of the iris species, probably a yellow flag iris. There are also blue ones that occur around here. There goes the heron. This is a kill site. A bird has been killed. It might have been a goose, Canada goose. It was killed by a predator. Could have been a coyote, who knows. But you can see the feathers here spread out all over. There's a cousin of the great blue heron, probably a great white egret. It's difficult to tell from this distance for me anyway. And to the left of it you can see a post with a box nest that's been placed there for birds. This is definitely one of my favorite trees. This is Caltus levigata, the sugarberry. It's got a very characteristic corky bark, which you can see here. You can see the corky outgrowths on the trunk. They look almost like thorns. And you can see, as I pan out, you can see some of the leaves as well. Very characteristic of the genus Caltus is the veins that, the main veins, 3 main veins that come from the base of the leaf, 3 to 5 veins. And yeah, usually they have kind of a smooth trunk, but the hackberry and the sugarberry in North America has these corky protrusions. This is a particularly nice specimen. If I move down the trunk, you'll see that it gets even corkier. Here we have a beautiful red bud tree in its autumn colors, with the seed pods still persistent on the tree. During the spring it produces these really pretty sort of lavender flowers, and it's one of the first trees to flower in the early spring. Here are the stunning berries of a beautyberry, Calycarpus americana. Beautyberry. What a stunning little bush. This is the sort of corky bark of an elm tree. An American elm, it looks like it. And you can see the elm leaf here. It's got very indented veins and serrated edges to the margin, leaf margin, and an uneven base to the leaf. And the leaves are actually kind of sandpapery to the touch, but the wood, definitely the bark rather, is quite corky, and that's quite characteristic. In the background here, the tree right back there is also an elm, and it also has the very characteristic kind of furrowed corky bark. Might be mistaken here, but these leaves look a little bit like a calorie pear. The leaves of a calorie pear, which is a common street tree in this part of the world. Not certain. So these are the typical lobed leaves of an oak. This could be a chestnut oak. Quercus montana, and the leaves obviously resemble those of the chestnut and the American chestnut. Here we have a tulip tree of the Bignoniaceae, Liriodendron tupilifera, a very, very tall tree that gets to immense heights and has a very, very straight trunk, used by the Native Americans to make canoes, dugout canoes. Has a very characteristic leaf. It looks a little bit like a cat's face with whiskers. So these immense leaves look a little bit like catalpas, but the tree is does not have an opposite leaf arrangement. So I think it's a large-leafed linden. Could be wrong, but I think it's a large-leafed linden. So these really strange looking leaves are sassafras leaves. Sassafras albidum is the scientific name. You can see they have 3 lobes, but there are also simple leaves on the same tree. So it's quite an unusual tree, Sassafras albidum. Tea used to be made by the Native Americans, I believe, using the leaves, but apparently it has carcinogenic effects, so maybe not so good for you.